Hey guys, so welcome to another episode of Bones and Stones this morning. We are very happy to be sitting with Sam Challis from Wits University, specifically the Rock Research Institute. So Sam, thanks for joining us today. And yeah, I mean, today we'd just like to hear a little bit about your research background. We understand you've been doing a lot of research in the Eastern Cape on the Mara project, and specifically dealing with aspects of community engagement and stuff as well. So we were wondering if you could maybe talk us through your research background and talk us through the issues that you've been dealing with in that project.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and I'd just like to say thanks for having me. And I think that this thing that you guys have put together is fantastic. You and Tim and Matt Caruana. And it's been going really well. And I just hope that people are appreciating it for what it is. And the expertise that you have between the three of you is something that people should really be taking advantage of. Of course, we've all now known one another for what, a decade?
Yeah, more, I think, yeah.
Just about, something like that now. Of course, I'm a little bit more long in the tooth, but we have, I think, similar interests. Our interests overlap. And Tim, of course, we had the same supervisor in Oxford, and I think both of us got to Oxford by somewhat nefarious means, because I would describe myself as not having necessarily been Oxford material, but the good thing about Peter Mitchell was the fact that he really knocked me into shape, and he put me through my paces, and I went there and I did my masters, my coursework masters there in 2003, and then I carried on with him and I did my PhD there, and all in all I was at Oxford for 6 years. But all the time I was coming back to South Africa, where I had worked previously at Wits for the preceding 3 years, and I was coming back to South Africa to do my master's fieldwork and then my PhD fieldwork, and then I was lucky enough that Lewis Williams, David Lewis Williams, that is the eminent rock art fundi, maybe one of South Africa's most famous archaeologists, had his finger on the pulse and said, when I was finishing my PhD, he said, "What are you up to at the moment? You want to come and write a book?" So I came back to Joburg, back to Wits, and I embarked on a book project writing with Lewis Williams, and I started doing the fieldwork for that, and I've been here since then. That was 2009.
Sure.
So I've been back for 11 years. But it's been a very different 11 years than the PhD years and the study years and the years as a junior research officer before that, because coming back in 2009, I had, when I was at Oxford, made friends with a bunch of people who were also from all over the world, from America, from the UK. They were working in Southern Africa, but one of them particularly had this idea in his head that it would be impossible to carry on in Europe or North America or other parts of the world, conducting oneself in archaeological practice the way a lot of practice was done then and is still done now, where people would go into a rural area, let's say, and talk to the chief and say, "I need 10 guys to carry buckets. And can the ladies just bring water every morning? We need water from the ladies." Without engaging with the community and without offering to help train members of the local community to in archaeological practice, very often in areas where people have no work, no jobs, etc., and just employing people on an ad hoc basis, paying them peanuts to carry buckets or to backfill or whatever it may be. And so the person I'm referring to is, of course, Charlie Arthur. And he had got a CRM contract with Peter Mitchell through Oxford University. This was before Charlie had gone to Oxford to become a student. He was a CRM guy. He was just working. They got the job. to undertake the contract at Metalong in Lesotho, the dam that was going to feed the capital of Lesotho, Maseru. And he said, I'm only going to do it if I can take members of the local community, speak to the traditional leaders and recruit members of the local community, go to the university at Roma and ask around there, see if I can recruit some people from there, the surrounding area, and train members of the local community, Basotho, to become archaeologists, and train them up right from grassroots, right from survey methods, field walking, through just sorting, very mundane things like that, identifying artifacts, etc., etc. And this was right back in 2009, 2008, 2009, and he formed the core from the Basotho members of the local community of what has now become the Lesotho Heritage Network, that has just carried on and grown and grown. And this Lesotho Heritage Network is what has fed into the projects that you guys have also been working on recently, also up in Lesotho. The key thing for me, however, was that I started my own research program on the South African side of the border, and I was able to employ some of those, not all of them, but some of those field technicians to come and work on my research program in Mtatiele, in the rural Southern African side in the Eastern Cape. And those field technicians were able to train further members of the local community on the South African side. So that thing has just grown and grown.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, Sam. It's such an important issue that you bring up, about us, going into an archaeological landscape and, getting the communities involved and not just doing our archaeological work and treating them as a separate entity, but bringing them into the process. And as you say, undertaking the training and, trying to add value to their lives as much as we are trying to learn about a landscape and learn about, Southern Africa's archaeological history. It's important about empowering people and adding value to their lives as well during the whole process. But I'm going to hand over to Tim. You've got a question?
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and thanks, for joining us. But and saying such kind words when you started, which we know are all untrue. But Sam, as you know, I've had the privilege, and it's definitely a privilege, of working with people who were trained through this program, and I'm talking specifically about Bondate, Retabile, Puseletso, and Mepulani, who I've worked very closely with, and obviously, like you say, many others. I think the benefit of what was achieved through Charlie and yourself and various others, Peter, it's very clear. And going into the field with these individuals, they know what to do. They know how to operate all they are archaeologists. Ndadi Tabile mentioned it at one of the workshops that they should be seen as archaeologists, and I certainly agree. So the one thing I'd like to ask you about, when you talk about the types of skills and working with these in communities, because it's a given in working in Southern Africa that you're working with communities. It's so important. But how can we create meaningful, it's a bit of a complicated question, but how can we create meaningful change within the communities in terms of what we can offer them? Like what you guys have done in terms of training people to be very skilled archaeologists, technicians, and so on. And that gets to apply in certain scenarios. Are there other things that we can do that can, I know this is a blanket sort of question, that we can offer to communities in the way that you guys have?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because it touches on the problem, of course, which is the regularity of work. So, we've just had a paper accepted in an edited volume. Rachel King, Charlie Arthur, and I talking about this exact point.
Oh, wow.
Where we address the different scales of things. So, Charlie Arthur's project with Peter Mitchell was a World Bank funded project that ran for several years, many years. Rachel came in, she was employing people on an ad hoc basis, one person here, another person there, from the collective that was the Lesotho Heritage Network that she and Charlie had created for her PhD project. And so somebody like Joseph Radimpe would accompany her on maybe one 2-week field trip, and that would be it. Whereas my National Research Foundation, NRF funded program that had started in 2011 was supposed to be an ongoing thing, but of course you never know if you're going to get the next NRF grant. So in 2011, 2012, 2013 to 15, then it stopped. And then I had to say, guys, I'm sorry, I can't afford to employ you anymore. Then just recently, the project that you were involved with up in Lesotho, a handful of these guys have been able, thankfully, to have 4-year ongoing employment on it. But it's I wouldn't say it's not necessarily hand to mouth, but it's not reliable.
Yeah.
But you know, the good thing about it is this giving people skills so they can go forward and apply for other jobs.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, if I can just jump in there, you know, with the work we're doing in Lesotho, I won't get into too many details on that, but that would have been impossible without them. Their knowledge, their skills, community liaison officer was Tabile with that skill as well. We would not have been able to achieve what we achieved in the time that I was there without them. And so those skills are absolutely valuable, but it's how can we take those skills and stretch them out over a year so that there's regular employment, regular work. It's a very difficult one.
If I could maybe jump in here as well, we had a very interesting conversation with Len van Skalkbeck, who's obviously also in Lesotho and who's running the project up there now. And Len spoke about his experience in CRM, and he spoke about feasts and famine. You know, where the feasts are few, and you know, unfortunately, there's periods where you just go without money, you go without an income in between jobs. So it's not as if it's an uncommon thing. It's just, yeah, how do we kind of circumvent that and make sure that there is consistent employment, you know, for these newly trained individuals? It's a tricky thing to have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. It was something that I should have perhaps mentioned towards the beginning, but I was already rambling on a little bit too much. But that was that Charlie, Arthur and co, when they started up this collective for the Metalong project down near Maseru, put word out, and they had a lot of applicants, and they had a lot of people start the program of training. And it immediately transpired that this was not for everybody.
Okay.
And there were a lot of people who were just looking for work, which is completely understandable and fair enough. And there were a lot of people who were just in it for maybe a job. And, you know, they quite like the attraction of the archaeological lifestyle, which is something that's probably hooked all of us, which is, you know, having a beer or two at the end of the day and having sort of good chommies around and that kind of thing.
I'm not going to do that now, unfortunately.
No, exactly. It's a dire situation. Hopefully we'll be able to look back on this and laugh with a beer. Yeah. But there were only really a handful for whom this was ever going to be a vocation, even though it was then going to be hand to mouth or, you know, piecemeal. And so that was really tough. And so the sort of people that came through were the likes of Ndadi Khetabili Mkhashane, who sadly, as we know, passed away just a couple of months ago. And he was really the most experienced. He'd started right at the beginning, but this was he was one of the toughest characters you would care to meet. Yeah. He was used to not having work. It was almost as if having work was a bit of a luxury, and of course that's not a good situation to be in at all. But it meant that he would absolutely make the most of everything. He was the fixer. He could sort out any problem whatsoever. He was a welder, a plumber, a bricklayer. He claimed to be able to fix anything that was wrong on your car, but it usually involved just draining the oil.
That's actually very true.
Replacing oil. But became an absolutely phenomenal archaeologist. I remember Jeremy Holman, rock art specialist that was working on the Podihadi project with you guys, saying he walking up a slope and Khetabili just bending over and picking up a tanged arrowhead he just spotted out the corner of his eye. And this is a guy who'd been training on Metalong for years and years and years. He'd been working on my research program, the Matatiele Archaeology Rock Art program, the MARA program in Matat for many years. And another project that came out of this whole thing, which was the UNESCO, the UN project, the bid that we won to do that in 2015, where I took a step back and I made him and Ndedi Puseletso the field directors. They did all the work. They became the field directors. And to my knowledge, at least, that's one of the first times that that's ever happened, where people who were erstwhile community members, because Ndedi Retabile was from the Sehlabatebi area, were made field directors on a project like that. But certainly in Lesotho. I don't know if it's ever happened in South Africa either.
Sam, just to touch on to something that you said to me on email this last week when we were discussing the upcoming special issue. I hope I can say it here. But another thing you mentioned was about the technicians' gold and paper in that special edition. Is that correct? I mean, that's another kind of aspect of bringing them in to the research process.
Yes, indeed. So well, it's actually only been one so far that's been published, but there's another one soon on its way, where we're including all of the field technicians as authors on the paper, owing to the fact that they contributed so enormously to the excavation. That was particularly on the excavations in Matat, and then for the edited volume, forthcoming edited volume on the Matatiele stuff. That's mostly students who are previously unpublished. Everybody except Tabi and Tabiseng Mokoena is thus far unpublished. So we're pushing all the student papers through, and then in the same volume, although it probably won't be peer reviewed, will be an article put together by the volume peer reviewed, but this article will take the form of a preface or an afterword, but it'll be written by the field technicians.
Okay.
That's really good.
But yes, so sorry, going back to what I digressed from earlier, was saying that, you know, this it's a bit like being an archaeologist, I guess, in general, and that is that this life was not for everybody. So a lot of the guys who were just there to make a little bit of cash, they found it wasn't for them. They left. This is when Charlie was putting it together in back in 2008, 2009. And then people who were just there for the job soon found out it was too much like hard work, and they left. And so this kind of core remained. And the nice thing was that you know, they were doing this for several years on the trot, and it was constant. It wasn't just a field season here or there. They were there on site day after day after day for months on end. And so they just had this intensive background training that Charlie and people like Hugo Pinto and those guys were able to give them really, really good training on. And then in the Matatiele research program, we had Hugo Pinto training, and you know, fantastic ex-CRM operators, and of course Will Archer from UCT, who was helping them train. So these guys were getting the best, you know, top-notch, top-level excavating skills. And then when new recruits came along, it was actually the Basotho previously trained on this project and projects that preceded it, like Metalong, who were then able to train the new guys, and very often in the vernacular. So where we were in Matat, everybody speaks Sesotho and Isxhosa, and they can switch between languages. So having a couple of Basotho to come down, they were immediately sort of a little bit suspicious of them. And then they soon figured out that they were effectively brothers, and they were, you know, related by either blood or by marriage to somebody else that they knew from some, and got on like a house on fire. And now they're this very, very tight knit group. So of course, Ndedi Puseletso is from the South African side, but he's at the moment working very happily away in Lesotho with a work permit, I may add. although he's in lockdown right now with Len. They form this very, very tight core. But so the next thing probably that needs saying really is, this is a small handful of people. We found it, and it's something that we're saying in our paper that should be coming out this year, even though it's been 6 years in the writing, is that it's been not easy putting together this collective. It made sense at the time for Charlie. It made sense for Rachel during her PhD to employ Joseph sort of here and there. And it made a lot of sense for me to carry on with the Matat stuff, but it doesn't make sense for everybody's project. And it doesn't, it's on every single dig site in sub-Saharan Africa, even though that's what we're arguing for in our paper. We're saying it should be illegal to just turn up and hire people off the side of the road, because you couldn't do that anywhere else. However, that's not necessarily very pragmatic. So ideally, what we're arguing for is that this should be the sort of thing that everybody must do henceforth. We can't believe it's happening so late. We can't believe that it wasn't happening immediately in 1993, on the eve of 1994. And the changes that were happening then, we can't believe that it wasn't instantaneous, and that it took until 2009 for it to kick in. But now that the ball is rolling, you've got the old guard like Len and Skullquake. You know, he gets a tear in his eye when you talk about this sort of thing, and he says, this is exactly what we need. This is exactly what we should have been doing. Of course, people like Aaron Maisel were, during the 80s, when he was excavating in the Tugela Basin, he was training people up, but they were never able to, at the time, go on and make a career for themselves doing it. But
Sam, I'm just gonna jump in now. And obviously, you've given us a lot of food for thought and stuff. We're just coming on to time now. So obviously, just wanted to say thanks very much. And you know, you raised obviously a lot of very important points in terms of getting the community involved, and you know, making sure that there's some kind of discourse between the people doing the research and the people who are actually on the ground doing the actual work. As we were saying before we started this chat, the people who are on the ground, the technicians making the actual discoveries. And it's not only the interaction, you know, this one-way discourse where the academics are training the technicians. You spoke about local knowledge. You know, you'd be in the field, and in Tate Retabile would say, you know, this is what this plant was used for on the side of a mountain. It's that kind of back and forth discourse, which is really important. So Sam, yeah, I think we're going to wrap things up now. Thanks very much for your time today. We really do appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. And we'll probably have you on again sometime soon, talking about some other aspect of your research.
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, you can tell I could probably talk about this for another hour or so. We've really only just scratched the surface, tip of the iceberg stuff. There's a couple of publications out there on this, and yeah, I would love to come back and talk about rock art.
Right, thanks, Sam. It was nice to see you again as well.
Thanks for having me.